Today is Wednesday, June 5th. My name is Brett McNeil. This is the Junto Podcast, and this is...
And I am Daniel Van Gordon. And today on the show, we would like to welcome an award-winning journalist and writer, Charles C. Mann. He has written for Fortune, the New York Times, Smithsonian, Technology Review, Vanity Fair, and the Washington Post. He is a contributing editor for The Atlantic, Wired, and Science. He has written 1491, a book that redraws our understandings of the pre-Columbian world. 1493, a book where Mann argues that Columbus's arrival to America laid the foundation to a new chapter in humanity called the, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, the Homogeneicene. And finally, his most recent work, The Wizard and the Prophet, where Mann highlights the everlasting debate between Borlagians and Vodians. Mann's work is an impressive hybrid of history and science, and his writing is a transformative experience. It gives meaning to the world around us. So we'd like to welcome Charles Mann.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to put me that way.
Oh, yeah. You know how in school with the economics class, they teach you about the pencil, and they're like, well, the wood comes from here. The graphite comes from here. That's kind of what your books do for me. So I just want to start this out. I think we'll start out with The Wizard and the Prophet. And so what are you today? Are you a Vodian today or a Borlagian today?
Today, I guess, since I spent a fair amount of the day in my garden, I guess I would have to be a Vodian, right?
Right. Yeah. Did you watch any birds?
No, I'm actually not much of a birder, although I did have an amazing experience with birds a few months ago when I went to Nebraska. And every year, the sandhill cranes migrate through Nebraska, and the entire world's population of sandhill cranes, which is about 1 million of these enormous birds, comes to a chunk of the South Platte River and spends a couple weeks there. And you can go there and see these absolutely enormous flocks of birds wheeling and cawing in the sky. It's just absolutely amazing, like nothing I've ever seen before.
We actually have plenty of them out here in Wisconsin. They've actually made a comeback. They're like everywhere now. Yeah,
they're gorgeous birds. And when they do the migration, you see just absolutely staggeringly large numbers of them. And the sound is amazing. So it was not I'm not a birder, but that was a pretty peak experience.
Did you get the chance to see any of the courtship?
Like,
the courtship? No, these are just in migration, so they're just wheeling and filling the sky along with innumerable other birds, and then they sort of plots down right in the river, and there's a number of essentially bird blinds that are made out of containers, I think, shipping containers. There's some run by the Nature Conservancy, and they were kind enough to let us go and peek, and so you're right there at the edge, and you see this enormous numbers of birds kind of carpeting the water. It's really quite extraordinary.
Oh, yeah. I actually live near a state forest myself, and I see that quite a lot. I wanted to kind of ask you, because since we're going to start with The Wizard and the Prophet, so in the book, you kind of highlight the 4 elements from Plato, food, water, air, and fire. Which do you see in the foreseeable short-term future will be our first crises?
Well, the thing that we're most immediately facing is problems with fresh water. And the basic problem there is that there just simply isn't that much fresh water, and a lot of the stuff that we do with it is pretty dumb. And so we're either going to have to make more fresh water by desalinating on a large scale, which is the sort of technocratic, what I call the wizard solution, or we're going to have to dramatically change the way we use water, which is what I call the prophet's solution. And right now, there's about 1 billion people on the planet who don't have access to clean, safe, fresh water. And it's hard to imagine a more urgent public health problem.
Now, desalinization. Now, in the book, you actually talked about the Israeli project where they kind of started that, made it an actual reality. I mean, isn't it very expensive to desalinize water from ocean water to fresh water?
Oh, yeah. It's quite expensive, and they do everything they can to reduce the cost, but there's absolutely no way around it. It's very expensive, and all the other schemes for using or creating new water are that same kind of thing. For instance, in California, there's a program to take the water from the Sacramento River, which is the last major free-flowing river in California, and channel a huge amount of it from the far north of California into sort of the Los Angeles area, and that will cost billions upon billions of dollars. And the main advantage of this is that rather than trying to change the way that tens of millions of people are behaving, you're creating new water so that people can keep on doing what they've been doing. And so there is a long struggle, which I talk about in the book, between these ideas. You just create something new, and so people can keep doing what they're doing, or you try to get people to change their behavior. And both of them are expensive in different ways.
How is it expensive changing the behavior?
It's expensive in a bunch of different ways. First, you have to get everybody to agree to do it. And so, for instance, you could go and you could say to all the people in Southern California, you can't have lawns anymore, because 70% of the household water consumption in places like Southern California is due to lawns. And you can go to people in agriculture who use 70% of the water overall and say that all your irrigation canals have to be roofed over in some way, which would be very, very expensive. So there you have to mobilize political support for people changing the way they do things. And there's just an awful lot of people who don't want to hear that they can't have their swimming pool or they can't have their lawns. My wonderful cousin moved to Palm Springs a few years ago. She has this beautiful house and has this lovely swimming pool, and it's surrounded by a golf course. And it's in the middle of the desert. It was just built a couple of years ago. And one of the things that you would have to do if you're going to change the way people behave is simply make that very, very difficult to do, which means changing the way that real estate people do their business, changing the preferences of individual people. Not so easy.
And Americans spend a ridiculous amount on lawn care every year. It's almost...
And there's diatribes about how terrible that it is, because it does use a huge amount of water for what? And so it is kind of strange that you go to Orange County, California, which is a dry place, and you'll see these beautiful shimmering lawns going for mile after mile after mile, when the native vegetation is all desert scrub. And so there's this movement to try and get people to change to what's called xeriscaping, which is to use native plants. But we're conditioned. We like lying back in the lawns. I do. So this is a very difficult behavior. And so it's costly to change that, but not costly necessarily. It's somewhat expensive in terms of financial, but it's really expensive in terms of effort.
And going on that. So, I mean, do you find that kind of demonstrates the insatiability of basically humankind? I mean, you talk about the zebra mussels in the book and how they just kind of eat up all their resources and then they just die. Well, I don't know if eat up is the proper term to demonstrate what they did, but I mean, do you think we just don't really care about long-term effects? I mean, we don't save for retirement.
That's the question, isn't it? And so so my book is about these two people, William Vogt, who is the sort of progenitor of the modern environmental movement, and Norman Borlaug, who is the progenitor of what's called the Green Revolution, which is the combination of high-yielding seeds, irrigation, and fertilizer that doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled grain yields around the world and prevented a tremendous amount of starvation, and got the idea that we can fix what we're doing by using science and technology. And we can keep going using science and technology versus the other side, which says we have to cut back. But there's a third voice in the story, too, and that's a former neighbor of mine, Lynn Margulis, the famous microbiologist. And she said, look, both of these two sides are deluding themselves. And the reason is that we can't escape biology. And we are, sort of in a way, we explode across the earth. We're an outbreak species. And the lesson is, in biology, is that outbreaks in nature don't end well. And so, and she always likened it to what you were talking about, the protozoa in the petri dish. And you put a couple protozoa in a petri dish full of nutrient goo, and they'll eat and reproduce, eat and reproduce, eat and reproduce, eat and reproduce until bang, they hit the edge of the petri dish, at which point they either drown in their own wastes, starve from lack of resources, or both. And she said that's just what living things do. And you name all the kinds of outbreaks that you've heard of, where you guys are, You have the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, or the crown of storm starfish in the Indian Ocean, or brown tree snakes in Guam. These things just go and go and go until they collapse. And that's what nature does, and we're fools if we think that we're any different. She would like to say, "Oh, you think you're special," and that's sort of the question that we're going to end up answering: is, are we in fact special, or are we going to just plunge right to the edge of the petri dish like the protozoa?
Well, it's a very odd thought to think that we aren't special, and that microbiologist that you're referring to, she kind of scoffed at the idea that what makes the human population so special to begin with. Is that correct?
Yes, and she said, look, every species probably thinks it's special. I'm sure that cheetahs think it's really special that they can run fast, right? Mm-hmm. And, we can run really fast, therefore we're really good. And she also used to point out that microorganisms, have very complicated genetics, and they can do all kinds of things that clumsy mammals like us cannot do. And so, they can combine themselves into colonial organisms. They can swap genes with completely unrelated species. They're kind of marvels of evolutionary creativity. And she said, if you're a biologist compared to the microorganisms, compared to fungi and things like that, we're rather dull. And so she would say, I just don't think that we're special, and we should assume that we're the same as everybody else. And she argued that this is the principle of Darwin. Darwin not only came up with the idea of evolution, but one of his important things is it applies to everything. There's no special organisms that evolution doesn't apply to. We're not special in that way. And so she said, why should we assume that we are special? It's comforting to our egos.
Well, you talked about Darwin, there was another gentleman besides Darwin who was competing with him at the time, and
Wallace?
Correct, there we go. Can you talk more about Wallace?
Yeah, well, he actually later became a spiritualist, and so later in his life he saw things differently. But at the beginning, he too thought that that much agreed with Darwin, and thought, if anything, that Darwin was a little chicken in not applying his ideas initially to human beings. And you notice if you read the evolution, his big book on evolution, The Origin of Species, that he sort of dodges around the question whether people apply. Only later in his life was he willing to say, yes, it applies. And the rules all apply to us. And Lynn Margulis, that was her thing. The rules apply to us. Sorry, you're not special.
Do you think it was because of external pressures that he might have been afraid of, like the church, stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes, Darwin was very afraid. He knew what he was in for, and there was also the question that his beloved wife was a devout Christian, and he didn't want to upset her. So he tried to tread a careful line between soft pedaling his ideas and not actually saying things that he didn't believe.
And we were talking about kind of Borlagians, Modians. Do you really think that anyone is one side or the other? I mean,
I would say,
do you think we're all just a mix of both, or?
Yeah, I would put it this way: there's no physical law saying that you can't be a mixture of both. But it is amazingly true, and how often people tend to sort of fall on one side or the other of this continuum. And so, more often than not, people who believe that the solution to climate change is to have lots and lots of nuclear reactors are also the people who tend to think that the solution to feeding everybody is hyperproductive genetically modified organisms, and also the people who believe that the way to getting enough fresh water for everybody is to have lots and lots of desalination plants. And so there's nothing that says that you can't be a nuclear power advocate who also believes in organic agriculture or something, but it's generally not the case. There's a kind of a cultural difference.
And do you think, Can you point out any specific examples of where maybe Borlaug might have been Vodian and Vodian might have been more like Borlaug?
Yeah. Okay, so Vogt was a person who believed in cutting back. He didn't believe in technical solutions. He believed in people changing their behavior, and he had this idea that we had to limit things. And so Borlaug's idea that we could produce more and do more was anathema to him. Yet, Vogt, after he wrote his great book, which sort of started the environmental movement in 1948, he went on to work for Planned Parenthood, which was the organization started by the birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger, and he was involved with the birth control pill, which is a technical solution, right, to what he saw as a big problem of overpopulation. So there, he embraced a technocratic solution. He was skeptical and had his doubts, but there's no question that he was, attempting to make it work. And similarly, Borlaug was very much about, trying to produce more and using the latest advances of science and technology. But from time to time, he would speak up and say, "We've got to cut back on the number of people we have." And so there was that he would have regarded himself as a Votian. But by and large, they didn't get along. And in fact, the only time they met, they couldn't stand each other, and Vogt kind of half-heartedly tried to get Borlaug shut down.
Well, Vogt, didn't he refer back to Benjamin Franklin's population measures? Is that true?
That would have been Malthus, who looked at Benjamin Franklin. What's interesting is that Malthus is the economist, early economist, who in 1798 published this sort of first famous anti-population book, a treatise on population, and he argued that human reproduction, if left unchecked, would inevitably outstrip the food supply. You could only increase the food supply by so much, and people could reproduce faster than that, and so the result was, misery. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of problems with that argument, because it's essentially saying that one biological species, humankind, us, Homo sapiens, reproduces at one rate, and other species, crop species like wheat, reproduce at another rate, and they're different inherently, and there's no particular reason to believe that's true. What Vogt did was recast those arguments in their modern form, and it's amazing to think that these arguments that I think are now so much second nature to people actually had a person who first thought of them. And what he said is, look, there's only so much that the ecosystems of the Earth can do. There's these immutable natural limits that we will transgress to our peril. And we could keep producing food, but we would destroy the ecosystems on which life depends, which is a different argument than Malthus, and sort of the foundation of the modern environmental movement. It's this idea that there's these limits to what we can do, and we have to stay within those limits, otherwise really bad things will happen.
I think it was the theory of human population. What was it? The theory of human... I'm trying to think of what Malthus's piece was called. But do you find evidence of that? I feel like a lot of modern people have ditched a lot of that Malthusian theory, and they've kind of walked towards Borlaugian trains of thought. I mean, today, I definitely think with the rise of organic food, there's a lot of people. I don't know if you'd consider recycling more Borlaugian or Votian, but.
No, I would certainly consider that to be, a Votian solution. Borlaug wouldn't have been opposed to it, but he would have been skeptical of the idea that it could accomplish that much.
Yeah.
And similarly, he wasn't opposed to, organic agriculture is in essence a system to do things in a Votian way, and to say, look, there are these overarching natural processes, and we have to stay within them. And one of them is the soil. The soil which does all the cycling of nutrients, and we have to do agriculture in such a way that it doesn't damage the nutrient cycling of the soil in the way that sort of Borlaugian style, wizard style industrial agriculture threatens to do. And so you have these arguments going back and forth between them have been going on now for decades.
When you were writing The Wizard and the Prophet, were you thinking about pre-Columbian Native Americans in your book 1491 and how they were kind of more Borlagian in a lot of ways because they changed their landscapes and their forestry techniques and their agricultural techniques and stuff like that. Is there a connection between the two books?
Yeah, it's certainly something that I thought about because they were not afraid to alter the landscape on a massive scale. The kind of burning that they did was just huge. So one thing that's interesting is neither the Votian side nor the Borlagian side are just sort of saying, leave nature alone. They're saying, work with nature in different ways. One is, we're in charge. We understand what's going on well enough to harness it and make it more productive for us. And the other is saying, you can't do that. You have to work within the limits, and so we have to understand what those limits are and appreciate them and live with them. And to a certain extent, Native people did both. On the one hand, they absolutely, where you are, burned huge areas, and lots of the areas that are now forested in Wisconsin, where you are, were open. A couple hundred years ago because of native burning, and so that was they were in charge. At the same time, when they did this for bison, there's all kinds of safeguards that they took to make sure that they didn't overhunt bison.
And
some of those broke down in the 19th century, but they were definitely there.
I was also going to ask you about the Native Americans and how they had a separate agricultural revolution, and I don't know if you've ever heard of the hypothesis in anthropology that says that almost begs the question that the Neolithic Revolution shouldn't have happened.
Oh, sure. There's a lot of argument. I think there's an article by Jared Diamond, the famous writer. It's called "Agriculture: The Biggest Mistake Ever Made by the Human Race" or something.
And that sounds pretty Votian to me.
Yeah. And the idea is that we are all so much happier than that. And there's some evidence for this. It is absolutely the case that early agricultural societies sound like they were a pretty miserable place for most people because you were working with really, really poor conditions, with really unproductive crops, often with really deficient nutrition for tyrannical states like the states in the early states in the in the Middle East. But at the same time, other kinds of agriculture seem to have been a lot better. The kind of agriculture that was in Brazil seems like it was pretty terrific.
Charles, what would you say is a misconception about pre-Columbian American that has eroded from the American conversation? America, rather.
I mean, which misconceptions are you thinking of?
I think he's referring to when people talk about how Native Americans never really touched the environment. They were wholly naturalistic. They didn't adjust their landscapes, things like that.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, that's just simply not the case. Relatively recently, I was in Northern California, far Northern California, in Humboldt County near the Oregon border, and there is a deeply forested area with lots and lots of Douglas fir, and it looks quite pretty. But it's known for a fact that that area was kept largely open and full of grasslands until the beginning of the 20th century by Native people who were burning it and who depended on the crops that came. They were called early succession crops, like hazel nut, which is a kind of low bush, and that was a major source of food. And it basically doesn't exist there now because we've created these sort of quote unquote wildernesses where people don't touch the landscape. And so there is a case where people burned the landscape and created an entire novel ecosystem that simply couldn't exist without human, meddling. And that you find replicated all over the Americas.
And I was also going to ask you, now that we're talking about early America. Now your other book I haven't really read much, 1493. It talks about the homogenous scene. Could you go more into detail about that?
Sure. The idea is the two books are kind of a before and after. And the one book, 1491, is an attempt to try to put together in one place all, the best of the recent understanding about what the Americas were like before the arrival of Europeans. And then the second book, 1493, after 1492, is about what's called the Columbian Exchange. And that's the idea that for tens of millions of years before Columbus and the people who followed him, the ecosystems in our half of the world, the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and the ecosystems in Europe and Asia and Africa, the Eastern Hemisphere, were essentially completely separate. And what really happened when Columbus and the people who followed him came was that they brought over all these other species in addition to people, and they brought them back to Europe as well. And these two completely different sets of ecosystems collided, and that ecological collision underlies much of the human history. And one of the effects it did was to make these very different areas look biologically more and more alike. They homogenized, and that's why some biologists call it the homogenocene, the era of homogenization. And for example, it's very simple things like where you guys live, there's lots of wheat and corn and soy. And the corn was here, but not the wheat and the soy. And wheat, corn, and soy are mixtures that are found everywhere on the planet now. And they represent a stirring together, a mixing of ecosystems.
Charles, could you describe what got you so involved in history and science and made you put them together?
Something I've always been interested in. I was a science nerd and a math nerd, but I also liked history because I was constantly amazed at all the crazy stuff that people did. And it wasn't until relatively late that I began to realize that things that I had never thought of as having history actually did. In my senior year in college, I read a book about the history of climate, and I was just sort of blown away by the idea that there could be, these long periods of time where it's much, much colder, or much, much hotter. There's a period of time in European history called the Little Ice Age, where it was extremely cold for decades upon decades. Or similarly, I read a book about the history of corn. So all the idea that corn, something I just ate all the time, could have a history fascinated me. And I gradually learned and realized that all these were entwined with human history, and thought, geez, some of this stuff is really cool. People should write a book about it.
Dan, out of curiosity, what do you say to people that say the Industrial Revolution has had no consequence on our climate?
I would probably say no. But
wow, I guess that would be pretty impressive. I mean, to begin with,
industrialization.
The industrial.
Oh no. Well, I would say short term it had a terrible effect, but I think long term the Borlagian response would be through innovation and industrialization, we found better ways to do things. So I should have been more specific. I'm not. I believe in climate change. Don't worry. I'm not a denier. So.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question is, there's certainly the Industrial Revolution has certainly had some huge benefits on the way that people live. I mean, right now, something like 9% or 8% of the world is malnourished, and until the Industrial Revolution, the figure was much more like 50%. And so that is an enormous change, and it's happened because of things like the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and so forth. The question is whether some of the downsides of it, the byproducts, things like climate change, can be, we can avoid the worst effects of them. And on that, that's in the future. You can't predict the future. The jury's still out.
Well, and I also kind of wanted to ask you about that. And, I do think about climate change a lot and how it's going to affect my children and grandchildren. I mean, as you write a lot about human progress, I mean, do you see a better world for your children and your grandchildren and your great kids, all the way down the road?
hope so. I mean, think about it. When I was born, I'm old enough now that when I was born, the great fear and the legitimate fear of my parents was that there would be a World War III, that I would be born and there would be a terrible nuclear war. And thank goodness that didn't happen, right? But that was, when I was born in in the 1960s, that was a really reasonable thing to be scared of. And fortunately, we seem to have avoided the worst peril from that, although as long as there are thousands of nuclear weapons, there's always still going to be a chance it could happen. And I think climate change is sort of the same thing, that there is a really reasonable reason to be, it's really reasonable to be extremely worried about it, but there's also a reasonable chance, I think, that we can avoid the worst impacts of it.
I think you also remarked on something interesting in The Wizard and the Prophet, and that was that, previously humans were more worried about the finiteness of the resource rather than the side effects of the resource. And I find that mind-boggling, because nowadays all we talk about is what is the effect of this on that, whereas maybe in the 19th century, people were more worried about, is there going to be enough oil?
Yes, or enough coal. Yes, people literally worried that they were going to run out, and they didn't understand, in a sense, how natural resources work, and we have a better handle on that, and that the kinds of things that you tend to run out of are actually sort of paradoxically sounding the renewable resources, and like water, like groundwater. We could actually screw up groundwater supplies, whereas it's much less likely that we're going to run out of non-renewable resources like oil.
And I was actually also going to kind of ask you, because there's not a lot on your background, and I figured, we grant a little bit of levity in this conversation. I mean, what's your academic background? I know you went to Amherst College.
I'm
not sure what your bachelor's was in, or stuff like that.
Oh, I was an interdisciplinary major in mathematics and biology, and I studied some history. I thought I was going to be a mathematician, and then my senior year, I started looking at the job market for the kinds of math that I like to do, and it seemed terrible. And in fact, the New York Times ran in my recollection, it was a front page article saying that there were 2 jobs for mathematicians in the entire United States that year that I graduated. And I just thought, whoa, I am not one of the top 2 mathematicians in the United States. That I knew. And I would always like to write. And I don't know why, I just did. And it seemed like I thought, I bet you there's more than 2 jobs for writers. and this thing that I had never imagined that I could do suddenly started looking, more like opportunity.
Well, I think you made the right call. Now, tell me, what do we have in the future from you? I mean, is there anything that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I'm working on another book as a pet project. And it's kind of in a way, it's an offshoot of this book I wrote, 1491, which is about the Americas before Columbus. And originally, that book was supposed to have a last chapter about the North American West, which is where I was raised, and it was something I was pretty much looking forward to writing. And it was my favorite part of the book. And maybe that was what happened to it. It was that it was my favorite part of the book. There's this famous line, I think it's from Samuel Johnson, that when you should take the part of any manuscript that you like the most and cut it out, because it's always the worst. And whether or not that's good advice, it's what I did. And the reason was that I kind of outlined this long chapter that was supposed to be the end, and I realized it was going to be way longer than any of the other chapters. There's going to be 8 30-page chapters and 150-page chapter or something ridiculous. And I thought, you can't write a book like that. Nobody's going to read a book with a 150-page last chapter. And so I tried to shrink it, and it just didn't work, so I cut it out entirely. But it sort of stuck around with me. And so I decided I was going to outline it for real and see what was there. And my publisher, I showed it to my publisher, and he liked it, and so that's what I'm working on.
And that's and it's about the North American West, just to clarify.
Yeah. So what they call the Trans-Mississippi West, west of the Mississippi.
Okay, so is that going to be the time period of, say, Lewis and Clark when they explored the West?
No, it's actually it's sort of the whole thing. So you start 20,000 years ago, and and try and cover the whole thing in all of its amplitude.
So, are you going to talk about? Are you going to go as far back as when Native Americans crossed the Bering Straits? Or
Absolutely, that's the very first part. Yeah,
I actually found that interesting because I believe they can actually. And correct me if I'm wrong. I read a couple anthropologists say that they were able to actually look at the different waves of Native Americans based on the linguist groups. So, for instance,
Yes.
the Navajo speak a similar language. It's an Adena language group, I believe it's called, and it's similar to a language up in Alberta, Canada. There's a tribe up there. So they can kind of guess based on their linguistics when these people came over. But
right. There's a bunch of different ways that people try to estimate it. There's genetics, and you can look at the very slight genetic differences between this group and that group, and you can try to estimate when they split off from each other. There's a bunch of stuff from dental records. Anyway, there's linguistics, is of course, regular old anthropology, and almost all of it is suggesting that Native people were here far longer than previously believed. And if you talk to any Native person, they'll not any, but many will say, "Well, we've been here forever." And to me, the functional difference between forever and 20,000 years is like zero.
Yeah.
That in human terms is forever. It was astounding for me to go to British Columbia and meet some of the folks on the islands there. And there, as far as we can tell, there's archaeologists have good evidence their ancestors were here 15,000 years ago. These people's, great, it's umpteen great grandparents. My ancestors came to the Americas in the 1600s, and that makes me, like, by American standards, U.S. standards, really a long time ago, right? Mm-hmm. And then you meet these people whose ancestors have been here for 15,000 years, 20,000 years. It's unbelievable.
Charles, where have you all gone to do research for your books?
How do you mean?
Have your travels taken you pretty far?
Yeah, for this book, I've gone to British Columbia. I've been been pretty much all over the West. Part of the reason to go to Nebraska, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, was for that reason. And then I've been lucky enough to, in researching other books, that I like to travel, and I've been able to go to 70 or 80 different countries.
you did mention you went to China and Wizard and the Prophet. Am I wrong?
Yes, and I also did that for 1493, so I've been there, I don't know, a dozen times.
I think it's crazy that you mentioned how bad the smog was there when you were there, and the girl wiped her face. She literally put a napkin on her face, wiped it off, and it was filled with soot. And
there was in some places it was absolutely extraordinary how much junk was in the air, and it made you realize, I think, that was what London was like in the 1950s, and probably New York or Los Angeles was not far behind.
Well, thank God for the EPA.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, we do not really remember. I remember as a kid going to New York and, having to go to a dress up because we were going to go with my grandfather to a fancy restaurant. And my mother, telling me not to ever lean against the buildings because they would just get filth all over this. And this was on the Upper East Side. It was, nice. And then I got into the restaurant. I was hot, and I took off my little, sports coat because I was, 10 years old or something. And I could see on the front of my shirt where the sports coat hadn't covered it, there were all these little specks of ash from the pollution in the air. And, the part of me that was like my sleeves and everything that covered it was still clean and white.
See, I couldn't imagine living like that today.
No, nobody can. But that was, that was normal.
And I do want to also make a point, because we're talking about travels here. In your book, you mentioned Wisconsin University a lot. I think one of Borlagian's, his kind of counterpart, or would you call it a colleague, that the Indian scientist.
Swaminathan was there.
I can't even say that
also
name.
Aldo Leopold.
Yeah,
Aldo Leopold.
I didn't know that he did his, I don't know if it was PhD or master's at University of Wisconsin. I didn't even know University of Wisconsin had that many famous agricultural scientists that were coming out.
Oh yeah, I mean these Midwestern state universities are great institutions. The University of Wisconsin, the University of Minnesota, the University of Kansas. All these places had enormous impacts on feeding the world. They were really, really powerhouses, and still are. Don't get me wrong. Now you would add things like UC Davis to them, and over in Europe you'd add Wageningen University. But University of Wisconsin, was and is a really first-rate place.
Yeah, and I think we're very notable for our dairy science program here. School even creates their own milk, and
yeah,
it's pretty cool. I've seen the facilities. They're pretty complex.
And Aldo Leopold started the first sort of modern what essentially boils down to conservation biology, and he started that there in Wisconsin.
So I don't want to get too political, but I would say, who do you think, and this is purely speculative, out of a lot of the people running for president, who would you say is kind of the most Borlagian and the most Votian? I mean, it's a tough question and it's kind of hypothetical, but I was just curious what your thoughts were coming into a presidential election, if those two mindsets play into that.
Geez, I don't even know if I know all the names of the Democratic. There's a person named what's her name, Marianne Williamson.
I think she's a very small candidate.
What?
I think she's an extremely small candidate.
Yeah, but I think she's like an eco person, so I would say she's probably the most prophet-like, the most Votian, and the technocrat, whoever is most like Barack Obama, probably.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Whoever that would be, I'm not sure.
Have you ever heard of using a carbon tax on carbon emissions for climate change? And I don't know if you think that would be effective as a public policy.
Sure. I mean, my own personal view is there is many, many, many ways that we could reduce it, reduce the amount of carbon that goes into the air. I mean, the biggest single source of carbon now, and that has been for a long time, is coal-fired power plants. And if you had a carbon tax, you would drive up the cost of coal, and people would stop using them as much. If you had regulation that was just pure pollution regulation, that isn't a tax but is regulation, you would drive the cost up of maintaining them, and people would use less. And if you supported, or subsidized things like solar, just a second. That you would also start replacing it. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we could go about it. And if carbon tax is the way to do it, then more power to it. I just don't think it's the be all and end all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mainly a Band-Aid to the problem.
Well, if it was a really high carbon tax, you would find dramatic changes in behavior. And I know an economist, James Boyce, who is proposed with a bunch of House congressmen a kind of an interesting version of the carbon tax, in which the carbon tax is really pretty high, but the money is returned to people. And so your gas goes up by $1 per gallon, but at the beginning of the year, you get a check for the average amount that people spend that people would get from it. So you'd get $1,000 check at the beginning of the year, whatever it is, and then you would have higher gas prices. And the argument is that people would start buying, like to keep the checks, and start using them to start buying lower carbon inputs. I don't know if that's wrong.
I would agree. I worked for a group called Energy and Enterprise Initiative, and they argued for a revenue neutral carbon tax, which I think
that's exactly what it is. Yes.
Yep.
And and if that works, more power to them. I think it's great. We're gonna have to do a whole bunch of things, and if this is one of them, that's great.
And then, what do you think about? I think the only one we haven't touched on yet is food, and I mean, how do you see food going in the future? Because, and this is going to sound crazy. So I go into a Burger King, I order an Impossible Burger, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah, I've had one once. Yeah.
And I tasted it, and it tastes just like meat. And then I started to think to myself, a world without meat. If you could convince meat eaters to shed their carnivorous preferences for this vegan option, which is pretty much tastes the same, imagine how much farmland you would save. I mean, do you think that, and we're not talking about ethical issues of is it wrong to kill an animal, but talking about just the effect of kind of these products coming into the market that would substitute meat. I mean, how big of an impact would it be if we went meat-free?
Well, it's a little complicated. The answer would be big, but it's also, to me, not clear how big. And it would be big in two ways. One is that it's sort of widely said that we may need to essentially double the amount of food production, and particularly of cereals and grains by 2050. And for two reasons. One is so that we feed everybody, including the 900 million people or so who don't get enough food, which is obviously a huge priority. And the second is that as the world gets more affluent, people want to eat more meat. And that's, so far at least, has always been the case. And much of that need to really ramp up food production is due to the latter fact, due to the fact that people will, at least in theory, eat more meat. So if you cut down, if suddenly everybody in the world became vegetarian, you would have need for dramatically less grain and so forth. But there's all these other things that we do with cows. When a cow is slaughtered, the bones go to make fertilizer. The hooves go to make collagen. The blood is taken off. The leather, the hide is used for leather. The fur is used for this. The whole cow is used, and we would need to find substitutes for all of those things. And right now, some of those substitutes are pretty energy intensive. Like if you want to have, the basic substitute for leather is plastic, which is a petrochemical that's produced with a pretty intensive energy processes that also produce a lot of pollution. So you would want to give you a really good answer to that. You would want to evaluate all these other products that go along with it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then even something like the Impossible Burger, which I tasted and it seemed perfectly reasonable to me. It's not a steak, and you won't be able. Eating those Impossible Burgers won't make that much of a difference unless they can also come up with an Impossible steak.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking of it being like, how when people started driving cars, that horses became more of a novelty. I was just thinking to myself, well, what if steak became a niche product and it was consumed in smaller quantities? I could see that too.
Yeah, that would be a very different world. And there are, if you want to look and you kind of squint, there is some evidence that might be the case. It's certainly true that younger people in affluent countries are more vegetarian than they have ever been. It is, true that red meat consumption in some places is going down, not up. But it is also true that in other places, the amount of meat consumption is going way up, and so it's really unknown what way we're going to go. It would certainly have a big impact if people stopped eating meat. Although how big of an impact, I don't think is really well understood.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with all that. I think it's going to be a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and there's plenty of reasons to reduce meat consumption. There's an awful lot of people in affluent countries who eat too much meat, from a health perspective. I know that right now that there's a certain number of your listeners who are paleo people who are going, "What? Are you crazy?" But I think that there's reason to believe that the kind of diet that most people eat, not the paleo people eat, which is steak and mashed potatoes and so forth, is not that great for an awful lot of people.
Yeah,
and if
well,
you reduce some of that, you would do better.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do touch on a good point with the paleo diet. I mean, but it could be a fad diet, could go away. So,
I have a good friend who's a major advocate for it. So I don't want to in any way tail. I'm just saying that So when I'm talking about reducing meat, I'm actually not really so much targeting those folks as the sort of standard, meat, potatoes, and sugar diet that's so much characteristic of so many Americans.
That's pretty much the Wisconsin diet.
Yes.
And then include beer in there.
Beer,
Yeah.
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 Which is, carbo. What is it? Beer is supposed to be. People call it liquid bread.
Yeah, it pretty much is. If you ever had a glass of Guinness, it's like drinking a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
That's a good way to describe it. But we just wanted to kind of conclude the interview. And we really wanted to thank you for coming on. I've been a really big fan for a long time. I actually got introduced to your books through my elementary school principal.
Oh, great.
He studies, he's got his master's, but he's taking, he's auditing classes at Madison or, University of Wisconsin, because, when you're retired, you audit classes at University of Wisconsin.
Good for him.
And he introduced 1491 to me, and I really love the book because it just, especially being from Wisconsin, it definitely changed my view of my surroundings and made me think more about just how we got to where we are now.
Oh, I'm delighted. That was my hope. I'm delighted that he liked it and that you found it useful. And
we really appreciate you coming on this late of an hour out of New England.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, no, it's no problem at all. I'm just sorry that my friend, not knowing this, has showed up, and I was jabbering away with him at the door.
Oh, it's no problem. But anyways, we would like to bid our listeners adieu. And Brad, would you like to say goodbye to our listeners and thank Charles Mann here?
Charles, thank you very much. Let us know if you're ever in the Wisconsin area. We'd love to treat you to some good Wisconsin dairy products. But
excellent.
Until then, we do bid you a farewell and everyone else listening.
And may even buy you a beer, customary.
All right. Well, I had some superb beer in Point Stevens. Point Beer,
Brewery?
I think it was.
That used to be a terrible brewery. And then they decided to get into the craft beer industry, and they turned it all around. Back in the day, it was like craft beer, but then
I had it relatively recently, and I was, wow, this stuff is good.
Oh yeah, there's plenty more where that came from.
Oh, great! All right.
Well, anyways, Charles, you have a good night. We really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right,
Bye-bye.
have a good one. And that concludes Season 1, Episode 3. We hope you all like that episode. Charles Mann is an excellent writer, and we hope you tune in for our next episode. And we'll see you later.
Thank you.